This is a production of Cornell University.
Great, thanks a lot, Andy. As Andy mentioned, today we're going to use the rest of the seminar period to take a deep dive into the benefits of soil carbon. This is a topic that Valentina and I have been deeply interested in and have been really excited to talk with you, many of you, over the past couple months about this topic. So we'll be sharing some reflections and hopefully just bring up some points that gets us continually thinking about the nuances and complexities around this topic. We can move to the next slide. Oh, perfect. So let's just first take a look at the current environment. There are a ton of rapidly growing soil carbon credit markets out there. Here I have listed just a couple, many that you are familiar with, but this list seems to be growing nearly on a weekly, monthly basis. And this is mainly being driven by many multinational companies making really ambitious and voluntary carbon neutrality goals for the next 10, 20, 30 years. And so some of these goals are so ambitious. We have companies like Microsoft that not only are they looking to become carbon negative by 2030, for example, they're looking to get rid of all their historic emissions by that date as well. So there really does seem to be an opportunity for carbon credits. And this is where some of the excitement and energy in this space is really growing and being driven by. From a policy standpoint, there are multiple legislation, both at the federal and the state level, that are looking to bring some sort of clarity, consistency, standardization to carbon credits and ecosystem services marketplaces in general. One of a couple, but maybe the most well-known one is the Growing Climate Solutions Act, where academics, private industry, commodity groups, government have all been on board on, hey, there's this need, there really is this growing energy, we need to have some sort of standardization. And we also need pathways for farmers and ranchers to understand how to enter these markets. Looking at our own home state here, there's a bill coming through that's looking to establish a carbon farming tax credit. And that should, if any of you have read that bill, it's quite vague. There's a lot to be answered on how that's being done, how that's verified, and really what that's going to look like. But the space is there and the conversations are happening. So when we hear groups talking about building soil carbon, generally from a greenhouse gas sequestration point of view, we also hear many co-benefits rattled off. Most commonly, and this is coming from policymakers, private sector, academia, but talking about co-benefits, one of the ones that we hear most often is increases in soil carbon will increase yield, or increases in soil carbon will save farmers money on inputs, reduce input costs, input needs, and input cost. And then there's also mentions of increases in soil carbon will build the soil microbial community. And we know many of these are true, but at the same time, we also know that these are going to vary by place, cropping system, by approach. And we know there are some complexities around this. And so that's what we'll do over the next couple of slides, is talk a little bit more about those details.
So thanks, Emily. So what is the real potential contribution that soil organic carbon can give us in terms of accomplishing or increasing these co-benefits or ecosystem services? When we're thinking about fixing carbon to improve or to reduce CO2 in the atmosphere, the relationship is very straightforward. Every kilogram of carbon that we fix in our soil is a kilogram we remove from the atmosphere. And we have a lot of tools over there. This map, for example, here, that is Soil Rubio, made with Soil Rubio, is showing how much carbon can we gain in different parts of the world by changing a management practice. So we know exactly how much is the benefit of increasing carbon in the different regions. However, when we're thinking about these other co-benefits that I mentioned, the relationship is much more complicated. And the same amount of carbon can have completely different meanings in terms of how it's going to affect water quality or food security in different parts of the world. So we wonder how these co-benefits or what factors do control the impact that we might have by fixing carbon in these co-benefits, and what are the knowledge gaps that we have to answer that question. So the main framework for our discussion today is this recognizing that soil organic carbon plays a key role in the definition of soil physical, chemical, and biological properties that build soil health and then therefore are going to determine the capability of the soils to contribute to different ecosystem services. And when we go in to see what are the soil properties that I mentioned or are affected by soil organic carbon, we can, here we are listing some examples, but we heard and we know that increasing carbon is going to increase water infiltration, water holding capacity, nutrient availability, and biological activity of the soil. However, when we try to figure out or look at specific numbers that relate carbon with these properties, we found that there is a lot of variability, and that the quantitative association between these properties vary a lot, and that the inherent characteristics of the soil are going to determine our capability to sequester carbon, but also the impact that carbon will have in these properties. And soil texture is probably the most important properties that control carbon retention capability and how carbon relates with these factors. So here we build using Cornell Soil Health laboratory data, which is put in a texture triangle, a heat map with showing how carbon contents are distributed as a function of texture. And that is something well known for all of us, so we cannot think about carbon without considering texture. And we know that soils with finer textures are the ones that can fix and retain more carbon. So according to what we were talking about, we might think that the rest of soil properties like water retention and infiltration are going to have similar patterns as the one we are observing in carbon. However, what all the work in soil health that Harold and Joseph and all the people in Cornell Soil Health Lab has done shows that this is much more complicated. And here we are showing some examples in the same texture triangles, just plotting other properties like water retention, phosphorus, and aggregate stability to show that they are not exactly following the same pattern that we observed in soil organic carbon. And we can spend a lot of time discussing what factors are controlling these patterns and where the samples are coming from, the techniques used to determine the indicators, among others, determine what we are seeing here. But today we just want to show that this is much more complex than carbon and texture. And there are many other factors that control soil health parameters, and that trying to focus only in carbon to summarize all of them might be a limitation. And if we try to go a step further and relating carbon with ecosystem services, this is going to be even more complicated because the ecosystem services usually rely in a combination of soil properties together with climate and management and other factors. So the increase in yield with increasing soil organic carbon is the #1 co-benefit mentioned by Strike in this context of the carbon hype. However, this is the best or most comprehensive assessment that we have relating carbon and yields nowadays. And we can see that there is a lot of uncertainty in this relationship. So overall, we see that increasing carbon increase yields, so it's positive, but the uncertainty in this data is huge. And if we look into specific studies, we found that there are some group of studies showing very positive and linear relationships of carbon and yields. Some other studies might show that there is no any relationship or non-effect. Others are showing quadratic or linear plateau relationships. And even there are some studies showing that increasing carbon might generate a depletion on yield. So we don't want you to focus in the specific plots, but we know that many factors explain why all of these results are correct, but they are showing different range of carbons, they are showing different climate conditions, management practices, if the crop is fertilizer or not, if it's irrigated, the crop type, and also a very important factor that should be considered is how the difference in soil organic carbon in the soil are generated. Isn't the same if we increase carbon by adding manure or biochar or changing crop rotation system, and what other parameters will vary together with carbon in each one of those practices. And Emily is going to go a little bit further in that, but the message is that it is impossible to understand how carbon relates with these ecosystem services without a context.
Thanks, Valentina. So as Valentina mentioned, to build soil organic carbon, various management practices can be used, and therefore, depending on the management practice, different outcomes will affect the soil health and ecosystem services. And so we might think about how might the approach to building soil organic carbon impact various co-benefits, and are all management strategies the same? And then as we think of specific cropping systems and different locations, we also need to consider how feasibility and cost variation are going to play into strategies to building soil carbon. So here's one example. Cover crops is a highly used approach to build soil organic carbon. And this is a meta-analysis looking at 4 different climatic regions: tropical, arid, temperate, and snow. And we can see that in all 4 of these regions, that cover crops can, yes, build carbon in the soil, can sequester carbon. However, if we look at the orange here, according to this meta-analysis, yes, cover crops are valuable in arid regions. However, we know in water-limited areas, this will have negative implications on yield for the primary cash crop. And so these trade-offs are complicated and have to be mentioned. Secondly, if we look at the blue box here, we have the tropical climates, cover crops used in tropical climates sequestering the most carbon. However, we know there's various implications to permanence of that carbon in the soil across different temperatures and moisture levels. And so again, more nuances that need to be introduced and considered in these systems. And the final study here we'll bring to your attention is a meta-analysis, or no, sorry, not a meta, it's a modeling study looking at European soils and comparing 2 different management practices. The first scenario is looking at the integration of crop residue in a low tillage system. The second is looking at introducing a nitrogen fixing cover crop and incorporate it into the soil as green manure. So this study was, this calculation was modeled out over 80 years. And in the first scenario, we see that CO2, this is a sink. The net GHG flex is a net negative. However, we look at the second situation, the carbon from a carbon standpoint looks fairly well looks great over the next 80 years. But however, if we look and consider the N2O implications, particularly after 2050, overall the net GHG flux is a net positive. And so we need to think about this. This comes to 2 points here. Is first, sometimes looking at the scenario on a short term can yield positive benefits. However, these practices and programs need to be looked at a longer term time point. The other piece, the second piece is if we look at just one piece of the system, such as carbon, focusing on carbon, we may ultimately be missing the bigger picture, such as the net GHG flux. And so this is 2 things to think about. So finally, Valentina and I really see, and others see, that there is an opportunity for a research engagement agenda within SCS and SIPs. We have key personnel, faculty across this space that really can understand and is working on various areas within this space, and many of you have already been and continue to be deeply engaged at a national, international level with government and the private sector and having these conversations. Because ultimately there does need to be a recalibration. There's a lot of overselling being done to stakeholders, and there's an opportunity to recalibrate those conversations and essentially embrace the complexities around the relationships with soil organic carbon and the co-benefits, because these relationships are complex. And if we look at the literature and really dive deeply into individual co-benefits, some are not fully proven, particularly in certain contexts, environmental contexts. And then finally, many of these soil carbon initiatives we can head back, are focused on greenhouse gas sequestration. But ultimately, there is a value in rethinking the system in placing other co-benefits, water quality, other soil health metrics as the primary benefit, and thinking of greenhouse gas sequestration as a co-benefit. So really reframing the scenario. So final reflections that Valentina and I have come to, but also would like to bring some of these questions to the front of your mind. And as Andy mentioned before, if you have an extra 15, 20 minutes, we'd really look forward to hearing any lingering thoughts or comments on some of these points that we mentioned, as well as these questions. But ultimately, the current hype is not embracing the complexities around this topic. And so the first question is, what are we missing in the system by focusing on a single metric, such as carbon sequestration? These conversations in the public space are great, but could there be negative outcomes if carbon is the only focus? What is the role that we have as a scientific community to include the complexities around this topic? And then finally, at the same time, is it possible to keep this topic understandable to the general public without losing the complexities? Ultimately, this is a great time and a great space that these conversations of soil health, carbon sequestration through agriculture, ag-based climate solutions is in the front of the conversation. It's a great time. And how can we gear research in our conversations and engagement to have understandable conversations, palatable conversations, but still embracing the complexity of the topic? So we look forward to handling any questions you have, answering any questions you have, and more importantly, look forward to your comments afterwards. So thanks again.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.